It was past midnight and the draft box was still empty. I had the Miami thread pulled up on one monitor and the reply window open on the other, but I hadn't typed a word yet, just reading the usual mix of phone footage and police statements about the fight at Bayside. Then a new reply appeared under my own username, even though I hadn't hit post. So the angle on the camera above my door looked different tonight. I refreshed, the comment stayed. I checked the post history. Nothing from me. The timestamp on the reply was 3 minutes old. I opened the security app to pull the front door feed. For half a second, the live view showed the back of my chair and the edge of the desk lamp instead. The camera icon still said door, exterior. Then the image snapped back to the hallway and the little red recording dot went dark for a frame before it came on again. I closed the app. The reply was still there, no username attached now, just the text sitting under the empty original post. I scrolled down to the first clip someone had saved from the Bayside food court and pressed play.
There was a family in Las Vegas in 2023 who called 911 after something dropped out of the sky into their backyard. They described tall figures 8 to 10 feet moving through the dark. Officers came out, walked the property, and filed it as unfounded. No further reports, no names released, nothing that stayed in the system. I kept the thread because the shape matched the Miami posts exactly. Same height claims, same missing angles in the descriptions, same people in the replies arguing over what the clips actually showed and why the official version felt too clean.
I pressed play on the food court clip. It was only 12 seconds long. 2 teens shoving near the pretzel stand, one of them holding what looked like a sparkler that popped twice before security moved in. The timestamp read 11:04. Another angle from the same minute showed the same shoving match from farther back, near the escalators. The replies under both clips were already arguing about whether the second angle was even the same minute or just close enough to look that way. Official statements said juveniles fighting and some fireworks going off inside the building. No power outage, no airport shutdown, nothing closed. Police logs listed it as a disturbance call that cleared in under 40 minutes. That was the clean version that sat on top. Under it were the compilations. One thread had pulled every public video with a visible clock or a matching background and lined them up minute by minute. The fight started near the north entrance, moved toward the center court, and ended with the same group being walked out the same doors they had come in through. The person who posted the timeline kept adding corrections in the comments whenever someone claimed a new angle showed something else. The corrections were always small that flashes at 11:06, not 11:05. Or the camera on the west side was already pointed at the floor by then. The username on those corrections stayed blank in every screenshot that got saved. The rumor never needed the visible clips to stay alive. It lived in the gaps between them. People kept saying the real movement had happened in the service corridors behind the stores, the ones that connect the food court to the loading docks, and the old utility rooms that never show up on the public maps. One post described the corridors as narrow, low-ceilinged, lined with pipes and old fluorescent fixtures that buzz when they're on. Another claimed the doors that open into those halls have no handles on the public side, only keypads and crash bars on the inside. Once the fight started, those doors were the ones that stayed shut on camera. The anonymous threads took the same gaps and filled them with taller shapes, 7 to 9 feet, moving in pairs, one staying back, while the other checked the service door near the old bookstore. The response that followed was described as containment rather than crowd control. More vehicles than usual, lights set up facing the loading area instead of the main entrances, and a period where certain phones in the area stopped recording, even when the users tried to keep them on. One account said the floodlights stayed pointed at the service door long after the last patrol car left the visible lot. I kept scrolling through the saved screenshots of that thread. Every few pages, the same blank username appeared again, fixing another small detail about which camera had been turned, or which door had been propped open earlier that night. The corrections never contradicted the official story outright. They just kept tightening the timeline until the only space left was the part no camera had covered. That was the part people kept fighting over. Not the aliens, not the word shadow, not even the size of the response. The argument kept returning to the same handful of seconds where every public angle either shook, turned, or caught the backs of people running. One Reddit comment said the rumor worked because it behaved like a missing stair in a house. Everybody could walk around it, everybody could explain it, but the empty spot still changed the way the whole room felt. A reply under that said the service corridor was the only place in the timeline where two stories could both fit. In one version, it was just employees locking a door during a fight. In the other, it was a threshold that had opened for a few minutes and then closed before anyone with a clean camera could point at it. I did not save that comment for the video at first. It sounded too much like someone trying to write the ending for me. Then I saw the blank username under it again, replying only with the phrase, "wrong side of the door." The timestamp was older than the comment above it by 4 minutes, even though the archive listed it underneath. The service door itself stayed in the frame for one of the longer clips. It was the kind that sits flush with the wall, painted the same color as the corridor behind it. In the video, it never opened. The person filming walked past it twice. On the second pass, the red recording light on their own phone flickered once, then the clip ended. I refreshed the thread. The same blank reply line was sitting at the bottom again, the one that had been empty when I first opened the post. It still had no username attached.
I kept the thread open on the second monitor while I went back through the Miami files. The blank reply line stayed at the bottom like it was waiting. Every time the page refreshed, it looked the same. I closed the laptop for a minute, opened it again, and the cursor was still sitting there. That was when I started pulling the older threads the Miami Post kept linking to. One of them had been sitting on the archive since 2015, the one people call the Ocean Factory thread. It was written like a single long post that got split across 20 replies because the character limit kept cutting it off. The poster described a mobile underwater construction facility that never needed pilots or a home planet. It moved when it needed new materials, stayed in one place when the work was steady, and built craft to whatever spec the current cycle required. No central command ship, no mothership waiting in orbit, just the facility on the seafloor and the drones it turned out. The craft came back when their job was finished, got disassembled or refitted, and the parts went straight back into the next build. The whole thing read like someone describing a factory that happened to sit under several thousand feet of water instead of on land. Later replies added the orange lights. They were described as tools rather than navigation beacons, short, deliberate pulses that scanned rock and coral and anything that moved too close. One account said a research sub got within 100 meters and the lights changed pattern. The sub lost power to its cameras first, then the depth gauge went blank, then the whole electrical system cut out for 40 seconds. When it came back, the sub was already drifting upward and the facility was gone from sonar. The poster wrote that the response felt automatic, like a machine that had been doing the same job for a very long time and did not like interruptions. Most of the replies called it a LARP. They pointed out the lack of coordinates, the lack of photos, the way the story fit every popular theory without proving any of them. A few stayed longer. One comment said the reason the story kept circulating was that it removed the invasion part entirely. No fleet arriving, no war, just maintenance. The craft were not visitors. They were equipment. The facility did not need to explain itself because it was not trying to be understood. It was only trying to keep the habitat running. That framing is what made the thread stick. Instead of tall beings stepping out of light, the story offered a system that had been in place long enough to treat anything on the surface as background noise. The zookeeper comparison came up in the later pages. One reply said if you kept animals in an enclosure, you would not expect them to understand the fence. You would just expect them to stay inside it. Another reply added that the facility did not need to be friendly or hostile. It only needed the animals to keep behaving like animals, so the enclosure stayed intact. The Miami Post started getting attached to the same thread after the Bayside footage spread. People began saying the heavy response around the service corridor was not about containing teenagers, It was about making sure the door stayed closed while whatever used it finished its pass and left. The thread never claimed the facility was new. It described the presence as old, older than any single sighting, old enough that the drones it built had been seen in every ocean at one time or another. The orange lights were mentioned again in connection with sampling runs. One post said they scanned both minerals and living tissue the same way, like the difference did not matter to the machine doing the work. Another post described the drones returning with small collected items and depositing them through an opening that sealed behind them without any visible hatch. The whole operation sounded quiet and routine, the kind of thing that only became visible when something went slightly wrong or when someone got too close. I had been reading for almost an hour when the folder on the desktop updated on its own. A new file appeared with a timestamp from 3 days earlier. It was a single image that looked like a sonar return laid over a corridor photo. The corridor had the same flush service door from the Miami footage, but the walls were marked with faint grid lines that did not match any of the original videos. The sonar portion showed a long shape on the seafloor with smaller returns moving around it in regular patterns. The file had not been there when I last checked the folder. The timestamp on it was earlier than any of the other files I had saved that week. I moved the image to a different folder, and the original stayed where it was. When I refreshed the desktop, the duplicate was gone, but the new file remained in the second location with the same date attached. I left the sonar image open on the second monitor and kept scrolling through the thread that had been linked in the comments. It was one of those long, anonymous posts that read like a shift log rather than a story. The writer claimed the small craft that showed up in Miami were not the main presence, they were collection units. The actual work happened later when the people who had been close enough to see something were pulled for what the post called routine interface. The Greys were described as the ones who handled the bodies, not in any dramatic way, just quiet movements, the same sequence every time. They would bring a person into a space that looked like whatever room the person expected to be in, a bedroom, a hallway, sometimes the back seat of a car. The post said the room was an overlay. The real space stayed underneath it, but the mind filled in the familiar details so the body stayed still. One detail that kept coming up was a thin rod of light, no thicker than a pencil, that they would pass over the chest and the sides of the head. The writer said it did not hurt, it simply made the thoughts arrive slower and in shorter pieces, like trying to hold a conversation while falling asleep. The person stayed awake enough to follow simple instructions, but not enough to form any plan of their own. According to the same post, the mantis figures never touched anyone. They stayed at the edge of the space, watching the sequence. The writer used the word overseer once, and then corrected it to monitor. The mantis did not speak. It adjusted the light rod when the person's breathing changed too much. The post claimed this happened on a schedule that lined up with certain lunar phases, not because the moon itself mattered, but because the schedule was easier to keep when fewer people were awake. I paused the video I had been playing in the background, and the smart speaker in the corner finished the last line of a song, then went quiet for almost 12 seconds before the next track started. The gap felt longer than it should have. I checked the pulse app on my phone out of habit. The graph showed a short, flat stretch right around the time the speaker had paused. I told myself it was just the way the app sampled. Then I went back to the thread. The writer moved on to cattle mutilations as the same process applied to animals. The claim was that the cuts were not experiments in the usual sense. They were sampling runs. The same light rod that calmed a person would keep an animal still long enough for the incision work. The post listed the usual details, the clean edges, the missing organs, the lack of blood on the ground, the absence of tracks. It added that the vehicles sometimes seen near the sites were unmarked because they were never meant to be traced back to any agency. The writer said the same pattern showed up in the human cases, only the subjects woke up afterward and the memory arrived as a dream that faded by morning. Another reply in the thread described screen memories in more detail. The person would remember being in their own kitchen or walking through their backyard, but small things would be wrong. The clock on the wall would show a time that did not match any other clock in the house. A window that should have faced the street would face a field instead. The post said these mismatches were the first sign that the overlay was thinning. Most people never noticed them. The ones who did usually stopped talking about it after a few days. I had been reading for a while when the smart speaker cut in again with a single tone. the kind it makes when it loses connection for a second. The Pulse app showed another short flat line at the same moment. I closed the app and opened the folder again. The sonar image was still there, but the grid lines on the corridor walls looked slightly brighter than they had earlier. I did not remember them being that visible before. The thread continued with the writer describing what happened after the sampling. The person would be returned to the original location with the overlay still in place. The Greys would finish whatever adjustments the Mantis had signaled for. Then the whole group would withdraw. The post said the craft never left a mark because they did not need to. The interface itself was the only record. Anyone who tried to describe what they had actually seen would find the words came out wrong or sounded like a dream they could not quite hold onto. I refreshed the desktop. The duplicate file was gone again. The original remained in the second folder with the same early timestamp. I moved it back to the first location, and the desktop stayed empty except for the files I had placed there myself. The smart speaker stayed quiet after that. The pulse graph settled into its usual pattern. I kept reading the rest of the thread anyway, because the writer had started describing the next stage after the sampling, and I wanted to see how far the account went before it stopped.
So I kept the thread open on the second monitor and switched back to the main browser. The comments under the long post about the Mantis and the sampling had kept going past the point where most threads died. One user had replied with a link that just said same pattern in the old names. The link went to a subreddit that collected older posts about Archons, Demiurge, and Watchers. The top comment there was from someone who wrote that these were not different creatures but different job titles for the same checkpoint system. They said the names changed depending on who was writing the report at the time. Gnostic texts called them Archons because they were the ones running the locks. Later threads started calling the same thing the Demiurge when they wanted to point at the one giving the orders. Watchers showed up in the older boards when people were talking about the ones who stayed behind after the initial setup. The replies treated the name changes like updates in a manual that kept getting rewritten so nobody could cite a single source.
Another long comment chain picked up on what the Mantis had done after the sampling. Someone posted that the life review people sometimes described was just the scanner running its diagnostics. The post said the bright light and the rapid playback of memories were the system checking whether the subject still carried usable charge. The replies listed timestamps from different threads where people had described the same sequence. The light appears, the memories speed up, and then the subject feels a drop in pressure before they are released. One reply had attached a screenshot of an old 4chan post from 2017 that used almost the exact same wording as the Mantis thread. The only difference was the year and the name of the poster.
Separate chains started when someone asked what the charge actually was. The answer that got the most upvotes defined loosh as the output created by fear, grief, prayer, and strong desire. The post said every strong emotion leaves a residue the system can collect. The replies treated it like an engineering problem. One user wrote that the amount harvested from a single public panic event would be higher than what could be gathered from steady individual fear over months. Another reply listed ordinary situations that would produce measurable output arguments in comment sections. Sudden bad news, collective grief after an incident, even intense hope when people gathered to pray for something. The thread stayed on that list for several pages. People added examples without arguing whether any of it was real. They just kept extending the list of inputs the system could use.
The next long reply chain moved to the Moon and Saturn posts that kept getting linked in the same subreddit. One user summarized the current version of the theory as a two-part relay. The Moon handled the immediate collection and the initial sorting of whatever charge had been gathered. Saturn was described as the larger structure that turned the collected material into usable frequency for the grid. The post used the phrase matrix engine without explaining it further. The replies treated the description like a diagram that had already been accepted. Someone added that the relay explained why abductions sometimes ended with the subject being returned to the exact spot they left, as if the system needed to close the loop cleanly before the next collection cycle.
A shorter side thread appeared under one of those replies. Someone had asked whether the system ever made mistakes with the collection. The answer that stayed up longest described a case where the subject had been returned with part of the overlay still active. The writer said the person kept seeing faint grid lines on walls for several days afterward, and that the smart speaker in their room would turn on by itself at odd hours. The replies treated the story like a bug report rather than a personal account. One person asked if the grid lines had matched the pattern shown in an older screenshot from a different thread. The original poster replied with a single timestamp and nothing else. I have been reading for a while when a new comment appeared at the bottom of the main thread. It was short and asked whether anyone had ever measured their own pulse or phone signal strength while reading these posts. The reply count under it stayed at 0 for several minutes. Then a single reply appeared that said the graph on their fitness app had shown a sharp spike at the exact minute they finished the Mantis post. The user posted the graph as an image. The spike lined up with the timestamp on their comment history. No one replied to that either. The thread kept scrolling with new posts about the relay system, but that one image stayed at the top of the comments for the rest of the night.
I kept scrolling past that fitness graph and the 0 reply chain until the thread refreshed and a new comment sat at the top. Same username that had shown up in the Miami threads 3 years earlier. The one that posted the Ocean Factory screenshots. The one that dropped the Dulce corridor photos with the service door left cracked. It had been quiet for months. Now it was back under the Mantis post, asking the same flat question it always asked, whether anyone had checked their open tabs while reading. The account never explained itself. It just attached old images and timestamps. In the Miami threads, it had posted a cropped shot of the Bayside food court with the exact timestamp from the night the rumors started, and underneath it listed 5 browser tabs in order, a local news clip, an archived 4chan thread, a Reddit witness post, a second archived thread, and a blank editing window. 3 days before I started cutting this video, my tabs sat in that same order. I had not noticed until the comment refreshed and the list was still there, unchanged since 2021. Further down the same account's history was the underwater facility thread. The post described a mobile platform that surfaced only long enough to launch the drones, then dropped again. Attached was a sonar diagram with a red overlay marking the return path. The diagram included a small inset window showing a desk surface, a metal ruler laid across a yellow legal pad, the top page folded back, a single line of handwriting visible. The ruler had a dent near the 6-inch mark. When I looked at my own desk, the dent lined up with the edge of the pad I had been using to note time codes. The post was from 2019. The dent on my ruler happened last month when I dropped it while reaching for the mouse. The Dulce and Men in Black threads from the same account were shorter but more specific. One reply listed the exact sequence of folders on a drive, raw footage, reference clips, audio tracks, then a subfolder named overlays that contained a single frame. The frame showed the back of a chair and part of a shoulder in the reflection of a monitor that was supposedly off. I opened my editing software to check the preview cache. The first frame that loaded was the same angle, taken from the webcam that had been covered with a sticker. The timestamp on the file matched the minute the username had posted the folder list in 2022. The Prison Planet threads were the longest. The account posted a chain of replies across several months, each one adding one more detail to the same story. A grid that appeared on walls after certain posts were read, a smart speaker activating the exact second a comment was submitted, a fitness tracker showing a pulse spike that lined up with the post server time. In the final reply of that chain, the account listed the tab order again, this time with an extra line, metal ruler, yellow pad, cursor on the preview window. The post was archived before I'd even opened the project file for this video. When I refreshed the current thread, the username had added one more comment. It contained only a single image, the same sonar diagram from the Ocean Factory post, but with the desk inset enlarged. The metal ruler was still there, so was the yellow pad. The handwriting on the top sheet now read the exact time code I had written down 20 minutes earlier. The LED on my webcam, which I had taped over, showed a faint reflection of light that had not been there when I started the session. The cursor in the editing window moved once on its own, selecting the preview frame that showed the shoulder and the back of the chair, then stopped. I saved the file under a name that made it sound like any other video about the mall. Just another thread of rumors turned into a story for people who like that kind of thing. The official reports stayed the same. Juveniles, fireworks, heavy response, nothing else. The posts that kept the other version alive never claimed they had proof. They only kept adding the same details in new places. One chain on the boards described a service corridor behind the food court where the lights stayed on after the rest of the building went dark, and a single camera angle that never got released because it showed an empty stretch of tile and a door that should have been locked. A few days later, a live feed from the same plaza appeared in an old bookmark I had forgotten. The angle was lower than the news helicopters, pointed at the service door. Nothing moved in the frame for the first 20 minutes. Then the door opened a few inches, stayed that way, and closed again without anyone stepping through. The feed cut to a test pattern and never came back. I closed the laptop after that. The LED on the webcam stayed lit for another 4 seconds after the screen went black. When it finally went out, the room felt exactly the way it had before I started, except the yellow pad on the desk now had a second line under the time code. Same handwriting, same pen pressure. It read the exact minute the feed had cut. The metal ruler was still lined up beside it, but the cursor in the preview window had selected the empty corridor frame again on its own. I left the pad where it was and turned the desk lamp off. The handwriting stayed visible in the dark for a long time after that.